Hello and welcome to the third and final training in this series on the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, also known as MC-FRM. I'm your host and moderator, Julia Neisel. I manage the Shoreline and Floodplain team for the state's Office of Coastal Zone Management. Today, we are going to review definitions and outputs of the model, and also look at how MC-FRM compares with other flood risk models and products. We have covered this material before, but we want to reinforce some key points. Woods Hole Group is also going to present some technical applications of the model. We are recording the session, so you can review the material at a later time. Team, please introduce yourselves and let's get started. Margot?
Good morning. My name is Margot Mansfield, and I'm a coastal hazards and climate specialist with CZM and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs Climate Team. Brittany?
Thanks, Margot. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good Friday. My name is Brittany Hofnagel. I'm a climate resiliency specialist with Woods Hole Group. Kirk?
Right. Thanks, Britt. And just a quick thank you to everyone who's here for number 3. If you were at the first 2, you made it through the first 2. This is the final one. So congratulations. It's been a haul. I'm a coastal engineer with Woods Hole Group and the developer really behind the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of the stuff that the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model can help with and provide to project plans, engineers, planners. But I'm trying to keep it at a level where it's accessible for everyone as well. So let's start just an overview of where we've been. Workshop 1 focused on that level 1 basic data. We'll just go over that real quick to refresh people what that is. Level 2 is a little bit more of the advanced data. Some of the tools that it was being used for. And then what we're focused on today is really these technical applications and some of the more, specific types of outputs that you can get that are a little bit different than just standardized publicly available data that will be out there. So here's the major topics today. We'll do, as Julia mentioned, a quick definition review and review of level 1 and 2 data outputs. Why are we doing this again, you might ask? Well, we get emails, we get questions, and there has still been some remaining uncertainty with some of the items, so we're just want to reinforce it one last time. Then we'll get into some comparisons to other models. We covered that a little bit last time. We'll go into that a little bit more, expand that a little further to some of the technical stuff that's out there. And then I'm going to give a couple of flexible design examples and get into those technical data outputs. And then we'll wrap it up with just going over again where you can look at this stuff and where you can download these data. So definitions again, real quick. Here's one of the ones that I think we've been stuck on for a little bit, which is this wave height versus wave crest, still water elevation. So MC-FRM at its level 2 data provides what we call this water surface elevation or this still water level. That's this dashed line right here in this diagram. And then it also provides a maximum wave action elevation or a maximum wave crest elevation, or in some cases we call it a design flood elevation. And just to be clear, what that is it takes the still water level and then adds the effect of this wave crest, not the wave height. Now we do provide wave height output, which is the distance between the trough and the crest, but the maximum wave crest elevation doesn't use the wave height added to the still water level. It just uses the wave crest to get this elevation. If you actually took the wave height and added that to the still water level, you'd be way up here, right, above where the water level actually is, right? So just to be clear, when we go from still water level to a maximum wave crest elevation or a design flood elevation or a maximum wave action water level, that would be the wave crest plus that still water level, okay? Wave setup really is just that incremental increase of water surface elevation as you get closer to shore. The simple way to think about it is like a constant pounding of waves that keeps pushing up, and there's a nonlinear dissipation that occurs that basically causes the mean water surface elevation to rise up. It's a important concept when you think about how that's included in the overall flood levels that you're going to get along a coastline. If you have bigger waves, typically that wave setup is larger, right? You have a bigger pounding. If you have smaller waves, that wave setup typically goes lower. So that how that comes into play, especially when you think about FEMA, when you think about the MC-FRM results and the water levels, is something that you need to kind of be conscious of as we go through this. So that's just a refresher on some of the wave definitions. Get a lot of questions about still water elevation, base flood elevations from FEMA, how that compares to MC-FRM, what goes into it. So first of all, FEMA for a still water elevation just takes the tides, right? And then the storm surge, and they base it in region 1 on all historical information. So the tides are, whatever they were at the time of the storm surge, and you get a high water storm tide mark, and that goes into their calculation and their analysis that says what's the highest water levels that you get at a 100-year level. And they take that single event and say, there's my still water elevation, which is just the tides and the storm surge. MC-FRM differs a little bit because we're doing, again, thousands and thousands of storms, not just a single historical event. And we're also looking at not only present day, but out into the future. So our still water elevation, right, is the tides plus the surge plus sea level rise plus wave setup, which is built right into our model. And that's a numerical wave setup, which we will circle back to again later. Still water elevation for FEMA, at least in region 1, does not include that wave setup. So then when you go to base flood elevation, which is what they put on the maps, right, then they take the still water elevation, which was up here, they add their wave effects along a single transect, remember, and then they analytically calculate wave setup in region 1. So that's their base flood elevation. So it includes the effects of waves. And again, that's just based on that single event. MC-FRM, when you get to that design flood elevation or wave action water elevation, has the still water elevation and then plus wave effects. And again, that's that full distribution of potential storms to get to that particular distribution level. So don't be confused comparing a still water elevation from MC-FRM to a base flood elevation from FEMA, because that includes wave effects. You have to go to the design flood elevation level to compare that to the base flood elevation. And even then, there's pretty significant differences, which we'll touch on later when we compare the models between what it does with wave setup, what it does with waves. Obviously, FEMA is just a single transect approach to things. MC-FRM is a full 2D look at where the physics of water moves. And so really comparisons are not warranted, frankly, but here's what those definitions mean when you start thinking about still water versus base flood versus design flood or wave action water elevation. We talked a little bit about freeboard last time as well, just to refresh that and reiterate that again. Freeboard is this safety factor that you add to go above a level that the water might be predicted to be at. And FEMA includes that in most of their calculations, because why? They have some uncertainties in what they really are doing with wave action, right? It's not really a physics-based approach to it. They don't have climate change or sea level rise. And so that lack of inclusion in their models means that you include freeboard, right? But for MC-FRM, we don't have freeboard included as absolutely necessary because we're compensating for those unknowns, 1. And number 2, if you look at how sea level rise is in the projections of that, there's a massive uncertainty between, those different levels. And so we're at that high end, that 99.5% not to exceed level already. So we don't believe there's any reason to include freeboard. That doesn't mean you can't include it if you'd like to, but we're saying it's not necessary. So our design flood elevation information, maximum wave action water level, does not include freeboard. And then the extent of flooding, this one still seems to be a little bit confusing. Again, we're using a fully physics-based approach, right? That includes the effects of waves right in the model. So the model waves and hydrodynamics and surge and tides are all talking to each other every time step in the model, so that the extent of flooding from the physics-based approach in the model goes all the way, includes all the physics, the effects of the waves, run up, all those things are included, so we get the maximum extent. When we present a wave action water level, we don't change that extent. That just explains where the waves are and what their elevation is on top of that still water level, right? That includes the effects of waves and setup and everything like that. So it goes back to that whole confusion over wave height versus wave crest. It's not that the extent all of a sudden gets larger because we include waves. We're just telling you what the wave crest is on top of that. And if you go all the way inland, right, the waves go to zero essentially at that point. And so the extent is really the same. Some of the special data types we're going to talk about today, just to get some basic definitions. I'm sure many of you understand these and know what these are, but here's some examples of some of the special data that we can pull out of this. Residence time, because it's a dynamic model, it includes the entire passage of the storm, meaning it not only includes the propagation of the water into the area, but also the recession of water out of the area. Of course, it can have ponds in certain areas where water sticks around, but if it can flow back out, it will. And so we can get things like residence time, meaning how long does the water stay in a certain area, right? The residence time of flooding, and which is residence time can be used for a lot of different things, water quality and other factors. But in this case, we're talking about a flood residence time. Why might that be important? So for in this standpoint of transportation, for example, if a road is wet for 12 hours versus maybe just during the peak of the storm for an hour or two, that's a big drastic difference on economic impacts for usage, for routes around that you might have to take when the road is out, detours, those type of things. So residence time can be important for certain aspects of things. Another thing that we can produce is wave forces. We have all the wave information. Now, we can't just say, here's the wave force at this particular location, because wave forces act on a certain thing, but we can get wave information to then produce wave forces on a proposed structure, proposed development. I'll give you an example of that later, of how that works with MC-FRM data. And then we can produce time series of data. Now, can we produce time series of the full distribution? No, remember, we have thousands of storms, but we can pull storms. And some of you are familiar with this because I know that you've requested data, and then we've provided data for individual storm events. And we can give you time series of information like wave height, wave direction, water level, wave period. And you can use that information, there's an example there, to then do site-specific assessments, maybe sediment transport, erosion, those type of things. So there's special data types that we can pull out of the model from the overall database. Now, we don't have those, at our fingertips because it's a specific thing for a specific storm, and there's so much data and so, spatially over the whole state of Massachusetts, it's not something we can just, pull out of thin air. A little review of level 1 and level 2 data. I'm going to go fast through this. We've been through this. This is the third time. Level 1 data basically includes that base annual exceedance probabilities, includes depths at various levels. Important to remember what these depths are, because when I'm going to talk about water surface elevation data in level 2, and we need to be clear on how to use those two data types. And then it also includes mean high water shorelines. Right now, we only have those available for present day in 2030. I'll give you an example of that in a second. Those data are available on a town by town basis, except for the mean high water shoreline. That's for the entire state. And so if you want, say, annual exceedance probability level data for Gloucester, for Falmouth, for Nantucket, you can just download that particular town. Level 2 data has exposure data, which is the extent of flooding. That's just take an AEP level, say 1%. Tell me where the 1% flood boundary is. We have those available. Water surface elevation data. I'll get into that in a second. Maximum wave heights, which is important to understand. It is the maximum, not the significant wave height, not the mean wave height. So those can be adjusted, but we pulled the maximum. Tidal datums, and then this design flood elevation, wave action water elevation, maximum wave crest elevation. It has different terms that have been used over time. But we all are clear now that what that is it's the still water elevation plus the wave crest, right? And that gives you that design flood elevation. And then there's this special hatching areas, which I'll cover again. And all that data is provided on a regional basis. There's a map with various regions, but when you download that data, it's going to be the whole state. You'll get a geodatabase, and then within that geodatabase, there'll be regions. And then level 3 data is kind of what we're going to touch on today. This is not publicly available, but there's some additional data sets that can be pulled and used for site-specific assessments for design purposes. And those are things like time series data of velocities, tides. You know, we have tide runs that go for periods of time, water levels, waves, all that information you can pull out of there. Wave forces, residence times, things like that. So again, that level 1 data, there's that coastal flood exceedance probability, or the annual exceedance probability. And it's available present day 2030, 2050, 70. It covers the full distribution of risks. That means a 1% chance is a annual chance, 1% annual chance that you're going to get flooded in that area. So if a storm comes through at that time frame, 1% chance you're going to get water in that location. It's akin to 100-year water surface elevation. And although I want to be clear on this, although there's these colored bands in here, 1.1 down to 100%, the data actually spans the entire distribution. So you can click in an area in the data and you'll see not 20% for purple, it might be 22.3%, right? So you can get a little bit more granular in terms of what your actual risk in an area is. And you can then, again, as we talked about before, look at it spatially and compare different areas, or temporally, like for example, this location, Marion here, goes from a 1,000-year return period water surface elevation to a 5% to a 20%, right, over time. And so you can see how your risk evolves with the changing climate conditions. Depth data is presented at 3 different AEP levels, 1%, 0.5, and 0.1. Again, these are available on a town-by-town basis. Again, although it's scaled here in 0.5 foot increments, that will be that when you click in there, you will get the actual depth. Keep this in mind when we come back to water surface elevation. And this again is applied and available at the various climate years, present day, 2030, 2050, 2070. I mentioned mean high water shorelines. Again, we just have present day and 2030 available right now. These come right out from the model. So the actual tidal benchmarks that we get, we then take those and we can actually get a shoreline that corresponds to the mean high water level given from the model, which provides a little bit more accurate shoreline than has been available in the past via digitization or other methods. This is just coming right from the model, and you can see the comparison between the shoreline from MC-FRM in the yellow and what was kind of available before. Not that it was horrible, it just was the method that was used to do it. And so you can look at what that looks like in present day in 2030. Currently, we don't have anything beyond that to date. Level 2 data, real quick as a refresher. Here's those regions I was talking about. There's a southern section that uses a certain sea level rise projection corresponding to the state standards from Nantucket and Woods Hole, and then there's the northern section of the model that uses a sea level rise projections from the Boston area. There's 44 total regions. That amounts to a massive total of 2,322 raster files, which I'll break down in a second. And so again, you download the whole geodatabase, which includes the whole state, but then you can load in these various regions for areas that you're looking at. The data it also includes these tidal datums. There's 5 datums available, mean higher high water down to mean lower low water. Those are just 2030, 2050, 2070. We don't present present day because that should be available via NOAA already. So these are the future tidal datums. They're rounded to the 10th of the foot. And remember, there's these special hatched areas that indicate areas where we have uncertainty because there might be culverts, tide gates, things that the model in a 2D sense can't necessarily pick up. And it's also important to remember the tidal datums, unlike the mean high water shorelines, which is actually a shape file that shows the position of mean high water on a map. These are zones that give you values, right? So the value in this orange zone here corresponds to this 114 polygon, and these are the values of that those tide levels in here. What it's not going to do is map where mean high water or mean low water is on there. It's just the value. You can then utilize those for things like restoration projects, planning for future nuisance flooding conditions going forward, those types of things. But these tidal datums are available in that level 2 data set. Water surface elevations, okay? Different than depths, right? These are the actual water surface elevation as opposed to the depth on the land. They come in 6 AEP levels, so there's more information here than the depth data. They go from the 1,000-year down to the 20-year. And they cover 2030, 2050, 2070. These are GeoTIFF raster files. And I'll just show you some examples of what those look like here. So you can see how that changes over time, expands and gets larger. There is, at the 0.1% level, this hatching, these shallow water flooding areas. I'll touch on that again in a second. You just need to know that those exist. One key point about the water surface elevations that I'm going to continue to harp on throughout this talk is that water surface elevations is what you should be using for design purposes. Okay, so if you're doing something, say a development or looking at a power utility station, use the water surface elevations to calculate your site specific depth. Don't use the depth data. Now, why do I say that? The depth data was originally intended for kind of a layperson view at what the depth is, but it's based on the model resolution and the information in the model. Now, it's a high resolution model, but understand if you have more accurate topography in your area, or you know what your building vulnerabilities are, right? Your elevation of your first floor, or a window that lets the water in, or just things have changed on the ground. The water surface elevation information isn't affected by that as drastically as the depth would because of the model resolution. Use the water surface elevation and calculate your depth that way for your design purposes. Do not do the opposite. Do not take the depth data, use the topography and say, here's my water surface elevation. It's not accurate. It's not the way the physics of the model would really work. You're basically saying, hey, whatever I interpolated from the LiDAR information in the model grid, that's good enough. And you don't want to do that. So always do the water surface elevation. If you're doing something for design purposes, use the water surface elevation and calculate your depth for those AEP levels. Do not do the opposite. So here's just some examples of water surface elevation. 2030, this is Woods Hole. 2050, 2070. You can see the variability in that water surface elevation. And again, going back to that whole idea that this is not a bathtub model, right? It has physics, it has things in there. Now, yeah, water surface elevation, we don't have jumps of 2 feet in lines like FEMA does, right? It's a consistent kind of flow of water because it's a physics-based model. It makes a lot more sense, frankly. But there is still distribution that occur based on how the physics of water move, the winds, all those things. And so you can see how that variation changes here in Woods Hole, and then also how it changes over time, looking at those brackets as you go from 2030 to 2050 to 2070, and that fluctuation in your water surface elevation. Again, water surface elevation data, that's the thing you want to use for those design purposes, for those vulnerability assessments. Turn to that information first, which is that level 2 data. Maximum wave heights is another level 2 data output. Just to be clear, those are again at 6 AEP levels, again, another 18 data sets across the entire state at every region. We are using a maximum. What does that mean? The maximum wave height, that's the maximum wave that occurs basically one time during the passage of that storm or that AEP level. So it's a high value. It can be translated to significant wave height, which is 1/3 highest wave, through calculations. We can help with that if need be. And that, again, you can see how that varies. And there's that special hatched area that exists again at that 1,000-year level where we get to the really thin, shallow water areas. Why did we use maximum? Well, at that point in time, we wanted to be consistent with federal highways and HEC 25 guidance, which uses the maximum water level to get to their specific design flood elevation, which is the 4th output at level 2 here, and provides, again, those same 6 AEP levels and other 18 data sets. And again, that that's that water surface elevation or still water plus the wave crest elevation. which is 0.75 times the maximum wave height, okay, not just the wave height addition. And that data is provided in all overland areas, just like the still water. I should mention waves are available in the water as well. So if you want to wave information to look at it, say in, offshore somewhere, you could get that information from level 2 data. Real quickly, hatching zones, just going over that again. If you need a really big detailed look at that, go back to the workshop 2 recording. But there's, we have tidal benchmark hatching zone, which is where we have attenuation in the tides that we might not be confident in. These are uncertainties we have with the storm processes, right? So there's the 9998, which is shown here. This is going to load right into your raster file as a 9998 value. And then there's hatching shape files that you lay on top of that show you where the uncertainty is. These are dynamic zones where we're not sure how quickly the landscape is moving, and it's moving so quickly that like you can see here in Monomoy, that it moved from the standpoint when we did the model to when we had the next aerial flown. So those are just areas where there's uncertainty in the way the landscape is. Shallow water flooding, that's a 9999 indicator in the GIS data. That's only going to show up in your 1,000 year water level, and that's just shallow water areas where wind might be pushing water in that area, and frankly are, in our opinion, zones you can almost ignore because it's just very, very minor flood depths. All these, you should be noted that the level 1 data is consistent specifically with level 2 data, so there's no difference in extent or anything like that. You could overlay the two and they'd be exactly the same, but we have these hatching zones to identify certain uncertainties, and those change with the climate year. So you go from 2030, 2050 to 2070, and you can see how those hatching zones move. And then the last one is the wave overtopping hatching zones. And, last time we talked a lot about how the wave overtopping is integrated in, but just to be clear, areas where there's wave overtopping, we identify as locations where you might want to think about site-specific analysis a little bit further to identify exactly what the volume and water is there. We do include it numerically. Every wave, we account for the volume of water, but there's still uncertainty in what that actual depth may be. And so that can show up both as areas where we have no data, which means it's just wave overtopping and there's no water being contributed from direct flow. And then there's areas where we have water surface elevation data and it's hatched, meaning it's influenced by overtopping and sheet flow together to provide that overall risk level. And you can see how that changes through time. Here's an example where there's just overtopping along the shoreline there, but eventually it gets to the point where you have direct flooding and overtopping together. So key points just to remember about the data, right? One, and these are things that we've heard kind of over and over again where people are getting confused. The extent of flooding. The extent of the flooding is the extent of the flooding. It's consistent across all data sets. It doesn't change whether you have design flood elevation or wave action water level information or still water level. If you're in level 2 or level 1, the extent is the same. It does not move. So you can be confident that whatever data set you're using, that is where the flooding is going to be. Tidal datum information. That's not a map shoreline position. Again, we have mean high water shorelines only for present day in 2030, but tidal datums are values. They're not a geospatial location on the map. They change geospatially over space because the tides change, right? But we are not trying to map that. Really important to use the hatch data. We see a lot of people using level 2 data, but they don't even know about the hatch data, right? It's there, use it, apply it so that you know where your uncertainties might be when you're thinking about design. If you're in a wave overtopping zone, you might have to think a little bit more closely about what's happening in that specific area. If you're at a very edge of something and you see thin layer or shallow flooding, you might get to the point where you're like, hey, this isn't even something I really need to worry about. It's at the 1,000-year level. Under that climate change, it's probably very, very minor flooding. And then the key thing, depth versus water surface elevation. You can calculate depth from water surface elevation. You cannot do the reverse. Don't take your depth and try to calculate your water surface elevation. We provide water surface elevation for you for that exact reason. Okay, so that was the going over the level 1 and level 2 data. We have a quick AEP interactive exercise to go through. We did this initially a little bit in workshop 1, but I think it's worth doing again. And you're going to use the CZM viewer to answer these, and you essentially fill out this table the best you can with what your annual exceedance probability level is at these 3 locations for these 3 time periods. And Julia will post the link, or probably already has in the chat, for you to utilize.
The link is in the chat to the draft viewer. And after you've had 5 minutes to look at these layers, write down your values, we're going to launch a poll for you to input values in for 3 questions related to these 3 assets. So please go ahead and get started. We have 36% responses on question number 1, but 92% responded to question number 3. Are people struggling with the first question? Kirk, we'll give it 1 more minute and then we'll share the answers. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the poll. And you should now see your answers and the correct answers as well. I'll let you have a moment to look at that, and then I'll share how we did as a group. Overall, pretty good. Okay, here we go. We're going to switch over to our collective results. Just give me one moment to share my screen. All right, you should be seeing my browser now. So for question number 1, we wanted to reinforce what Kirk said about the symbology on the map, providing a more coarse depiction of the AAP, and the fact that you can click on your asset and actually get the value for that location. So in this case, the correct answer was both less than 10% as well as 5.2%. So thank you for working your way through that question. And then for the second question, we wanted you to look at the change between the 2050 and 2070 scenarios for the Yarmouth Fire Department headquarters. So it went from 1% to 2%. So the difference is 1% there. The majority of you did answer that correctly. And then the final one, we wanted you to think about the correlation between annual exceedance probabilities and the average occurrence in a given scenario year. So in this case, the 2070 scenario for the East Boston Library indicates that they could experience 1 flooding event on average per year at that location. And the majority of you did get that correct. So good work. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Kirk.
You should see my screen again. And here's the results. And as Julia mentioned, now you can just, if you did take the time to fill out the table, thank you.
Kirk, we don't see your screen yet.
Okay. Let me try again.
Thank you.
How about now?
Now you're good. Thank you.
Okay. So here's the full table results filled out if you were interested in that. And then if you took it to the next level and looked beyond or clicked in there and looked at the actual percentages I was mentioning, you can start to see how there's the actual numbers. That's where that 5.2 came from. I think one of the things important to note is that the 100%, right, because of the way that it's bracketed, in many cases, that doesn't mean every single year if you're at the 75% level, for example. So if you need more granular information, you can get that by clicking in there. So there's the answers. This will be available on the after the fact if you wanted to go back and check your answers some more. I'm going to push forward into the next section, which is comparisons to other models. We covered this a little bit last time. I want to go into it a little bit more. The big one that everybody keeps talking about is FEMA, which understandably was the only thing out there for the longest time to utilize, right? And it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that there's differences, and there's the purpose is the primary difference, right? FEMA is really looking at a specific storm event for insurance purposes, for doing that work. Whereas what the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model really is looking at is forward in time, a full distribution of risk of storms for planning purposes and not trying to assign any type of risk level to specific, financial requirements or anything of that nature. So some of the more technical differences, FEMA Region 1, we've talked about this before, does not use physics-based modeling. So other regions, South Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, they actually do use a very similar approach to MC-FRM, at least up to the coastline, to get the physics of the wave surge combination correctly. But in Region 1, they base it all on historical data. Again, that looks backwards in time. It does not look forward. So there's no sea level rise. There's no climate change incorporated in the FEMA maps. One of the big differences we see is it's not a variable mapping effort, time variable. What that means is if FEMA says the high water elevation gets to 10, that basically means if the water can get to that area, it's going to get to that area, meaning it stays at 10. That peak stays at 10 as long as it needs to get to flow to that area. And we see a lot of places where we might peak at 10, but that peak is relatively short occurring, especially if you have a tropical cyclone or hurricane that comes up and you can't actually pass the volume of water through, a narrow opening into a large basin to fill it to the extent that might be required. There really is a drastic difference in the methodologies here. The one storm versus the thousands of storms. The way that FEMA calculates wave setup is this analytical method based on the West Coast. There's been a number of groups that have looked at that to assess, kind of the inaccuracy of that. And so we use a numerical based wave setup, which numerous other companies, I know some of the people on this call, have utilized to basically do letters of map revision and showing that, look, the wave setup that is being calculated by this analytical method really isn't very good. So it's not really valid for comparison reasons. I put these charts on here just to indicate kind of some of the, when we did the remapping in Lomer for the city of Boston, you can see these are the high water marks that exist kind of throughout the Boston Harbor Basin, these little blue triangles. The red is actually the measured Boston tide gauge information for the 1978 nor'easter. And the high water mark used by the FEMA analysis, they just picked one, was the one that was very, very high up here at 14.3. And you can kind of see that the measured water level in Boston Harbor is 9.52, but they used 14.3. This is one of the reasons we were successful in kind of remapping some of the Boston area Lomer information. It just, because they're using historical data and not doing a physics-based approach, there's some assumptions that went into this that create some discrepancies between our right. The bottom line is FEMA has its own thing. It's its own purpose. Don't try to compare them. It's not really valid for a lot of different reasons, and people always try to do that. It's different. If you're looking forward in time, you're looking for planning, MC-FRM is the data that you're going to want to use. If you're doing building codes to date, although this is evolving and changing, that's what FEMA's you're going to have to use. But if you're looking beyond that, if you're looking out to 2050, 2070, MC-FRM results are going to generally be higher than those. And so if you want to go to that next level for climate change planning, that's where you need to look. They're just really different approaches. The methodology is so different. It's a really analytical FEMA-based approach, historical storms. Ours is, the MC-FRM is way more physics-based. SLOSH is another one that's out there. This is the National Storm Surge Hazard Maps. We've talked about this in the past. It's a very coarse model. SLOSH uses, it's just hurricanes, which when you start to think about Boston and north of Cape Cod, really becomes questionable. There's no AEP levels here. It's just, what do you get if you get a Category 3 hurricane? And they do run multiple Category 3 hurricanes, but it's in approach lines, but it's not, overall risk or probability of risk. So when you're looking at this, you have no idea what a Category 3 hurricane's probability of occurring here might be, right? So is it, an AEP of 1% or 0.1% or 0.001%, right? So there's the ability for planning or design purposes kind of is limited. That again, it's just present day. There's nothing in the future here. Doesn't include waves. Really, again, the purpose is worst case scenario, storm of the millennia, right? A hurricane that maybe we've never seen here. If that's coming and we have time to think about it, how do we evacuate? How do we think about that? It's not for like, what should I put my building level at, or where should I do this specific design? It really doesn't work for that. And again, it's just present day. The other one that some of you may know about is First Street Foundation. They have a number of different flood maps that they present. They do have pluvial and fluvial for inland areas. They also do coastal. It's a national scale assessment. So for their coastal model, it's an extremely coarse model. It's called GeoClaw. The highest resolution they get to is 400 plus meters. MC-FRM is down to 10, 5 meter type scale. We're trying to get really high resolution information. We're simulating that flow overland. They just bring it up to the coastline and then stop. At the coastline, they then use bathtub approaches over the landscape using LiDAR to predict their flooding. So at its core, it still is kind of this modified bathtub approach. They get a distribution. They do simulate a lot of storm events in kind of the same approach we do in a Monte Carlo approach, but they don't translate that overland, and it's very, very coarse. So they get 1 point covering a large area, and they say, let's translate that water level overland via bathtub approach to see where it's flooded. It doesn't include wave setup, run up, and other factors. It's just surge. And they do and readily admit they try to compare that to best in class models like AdCirc that's being applied for MC-FRM. And again, they're trying to do something on a national scale. You can go in there and do kind of these, property checks. However, I would caution there is some limitations to what that data really is and means from the standpoint of the coarseness of the domain, and they're trying to do it on a very large scale. I think it's a pretty good first order estimate of what you might be happening. I don't know if you should be using it for design purposes at any level. And then there's the North Atlantic Comprehensive Coastal Study done by the U.S. Army Corps. We went through this before, and I mentioned, interestingly, we were on the review board for the NACS model. We had Army Corps people on the review board for MC-FRM. And, ultimately they were, again, for a little bit different purposes. NACS really was looking at redefining their tidal flood profile curves for the Northeast. Again, there's no sea level rise or future conditions integrated in there. Now they do, do some linear additions of things, but again, that's linear. There's a little slight difference in the model, the wave model that's used. They use ST Wave, we use UNSWAN. The grid resolution, you can see A is, kind of the NACS grid resolution. This is on Martha's Vineyard near Edgartown. B is MC-FRM model grid resolution. And again, they don't necessarily go overland everywhere, right? So it's, this area here on the south side of Edgartown Harbor, they basically, water can't flow there, even though that we know that's a pretty low lying area where water goes over. So it's things like that where they're different. Again, their purpose was really to redefine that full distribution of flood risk along the shoreline. Their focus area is that red area in the map, not necessarily Massachusetts. Again, this was the kind of the sandy, hit zone, and that's where this kind of came out. They don't do run up and overtopping structures, anything of that nature. It's a very good study. I think it's a really important study there, but there are some key differences between the two. We do use NACS for certain things on a regular basis. We do compare MC-FRM results to NACS. We did calibrations throughout to make sure our information on their water was very comparable to what they were getting. There is a big difference in our storm sets, though. We use a Monte Carlo based synthetic approach with all the historical storms. They're using a JPMOS, joint probability methodology. And so there's some differences there. But at the end of the day, when we compare our present day distributions, they're very reasonable. And again, we can't compare to the future because that's not what NACS does. So most of the models where the difference is they're not looking forward in time, and MC-FRM really is. Let's get a little bit into this flexible design approach using MC-FRM data. So this is where we're getting into some of the level 3 information, how to apply it, how to use it. I'm just going to give a couple examples that we've done. using flexible design approach using MC-FRM data. The Island Dock design in Woods Hole is one example. This is the research dock that Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution utilizes. So they have things where they actually have a wet bay in there that they do testing on. They need to be able to access the building and the ship at the same time with equipment and forklifts to load their vessels. And so they understood that the pier dock was getting near the end of its service life. They were designing a new thing. And they wanted to take into consideration, hey, we want to be able to operate in the future. They wanted a 100-year service life. They didn't want to impede operations. And so it obviously needed to be raised up, but you couldn't raise it up to the point where you had to basically go down a steep slope to get onto the vessel. You had to be able to access the vessel with forklifts and things of that nature. And also you didn't want to have the building so high that you couldn't get in and out of the building with required equipment. You still wanted to have access to the water. So it was really a modular dock design that was developed, which essentially meant, okay, we're going to raise up the deck level to a certain point where it's still functional for your normal day, present day tidal conditions, with some, flexibility towards the future. But the actual piles that the dock was put on were over designed so that you could increase the deck elevation over time. Likewise, the new building on the facility had the first floor had very, very high ceilings so that you could increase that deck elevation over time. So you weren't isolating an island in the community, which also had, connections to the road and utilities and everything else, but you had the flexibility to be able to add decking over time as sea level rise actually potentially occurred and at what rate it occurred, as opposed to trying to say, okay, it's going to occur at the high rate. I need to put this up, 6 feet above the rest of the infrastructure. And then the whole thing didn't work. So just one way to think about it, MC-FRM data was used throughout that to pick those design flood elevations and levels and think about the way that you could modularly address that specific dock design. Another example, Marion Wareham Bridge, Route 6 bridge assessment, river crossing. This bridge was due for replacement. It's in a very kind of low-lying area, not necessarily prone to extratropical conditions, but tropical cyclones were potentially an issue here. And so we looked at these thresholds where, hey, there was a point where no matter what you did with the bridge, it was going to be flanked and flooded. The approaches for long distances were going to be flooded. And so you couldn't possibly raise it to, the 100-year or 50-year design level, because even if you did, again, you wouldn't really even be able to get to the bridge, right? So those yellow areas in the overall distribution, and this is information that we pulled from Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, said, hey, when you're getting to those elevations, it's flanking the bridge anyways, right? Below that in the red is when the water surface elevation was between the low chord and the deck of the bridge. So that was an area where you were getting, pressure flow underneath the bridge. You might have problems with forces on the substructure of the bridge. And the green was below the low chord. That was fine. And so that white zone there was like, oh, well, that was an area where you could raise the bridge up enough where it would still be functional and the approaches would still work, but the bridge would be underwater if it was left as at the elevation it was today, which the road deck was at about 10. So that helped them think about the proposed design where we weren't going to the design flood elevation that was necessarily recommended, which was, a 2070, 1% or greater, gets you at 18 to 19 feet NAVD 88 using that design flood or the maximum wave crest elevation. But we brought it up to 13, which basically allowed the road to be usable for a much broader span of time. Present day, that went from a 50-year return period event to a 200-year. And so now that red area was where the bridge was still functional, the water was there, it might have been attenuated, but it was dry and drivable. And again, once you got to the point where it was flanked, it didn't really matter anymore. Another thing they were looking at was these causeway that was in between. There was a big push to remove that causeway. So when we start thinking about how you can use MC-FRM data, we extracted information from the boundaries of MC-FRM or up into the river here, the Weweantic River, and then did a submodel looking at the hydrodynamics and the flow underneath that bridge with pressure flow through there to say what happens with or without a causeway. There was a push to remove that causeway. Mass DOT didn't think it was a good idea. And what we started looking at was when if you took the causeway out, normal tides were able to get in and out there at the same level with or without the causeway, because the causeway did not restrict flow enough that normal tides were a problem. But during storm events, there was actually a benefit to having the causeway there because it did attenuate that higher water surface elevation through time. And if you took the causeway out, you started to flood additional buildings in the area because of the project itself, meaning the redesign of the bridge and the removal of the causeway, to the point where you were getting anywhere from 15 to 25 additional buildings flooded just by removing the causeway in the redesign. That's different than just raising the bridge elevation for transportation purposes, but there was also a side piece to this whole approach and flexible design. Why am I talking about this? Well, because if you just look at the basic level and information, it's going to tell you to go to like that 18.8 feet, but that might not be, reasonable or functional from a lot of different standpoints. But then you can utilize that full distribution data to find that key area that says, this is why this design makes sense. I can't go all the way there. I can get to here, and that provides really, really good value. The bridge needs to be rebuilt, so on and so forth. And you can start looking at things like that overall distribution. You lose that if you're just stuck with a FEMA 100-year event under present day with some kind of, freeboard added onto it. One last example of these flexible approaches. This is Surf Drive in Falmouth, Massachusetts. It's in a pretty low-lying area. Again, it's a pretty scenic road that exists. It's exposed to daily high tide flooding in the future. It's got storm surge problems. Obviously, it's faced with coastal erosion, and the community was really stuck on what are we going to do here. It's on a barrier beach. Has some homes on that barrier beach, has a road, has a sewer line that runs through there, the main sewer line that goes all the way to the Woods Hole community. So there's a power station that runs out to Martha's Vineyard that's housed through this area. So a lot of action going on here. I know some of the people online have worked in this area on some of the different assets that might exist. What we were looking to do here is really think about this in a dynamic, adaptable way. And so we developed these themes or approaches to think about this area, including all the different assets that exist, from, emphasizing kind of ecosystem health over the long term. Maybe they were going down a road of just protection was our ultimate thing. Maybe it was connection. We really need to keep that transportation, the utility, the bike path open and available. And then there was this idea of, managed retreat over time that was integrated in. And so we use the dynamic adaptation pathways for each asset in the area, focusing on those various themes. I'm not going to dig into this too deep, as this is a topic for another whole talk, but I want to get the idea that essentially the MC-FRM data was utilized to basically help determine where these changes or decision points had to be made, where things no longer functioned in a way that was adequate. So for example, if they just raised the roadway here following that kind of protection approach, there was a point in time that it wouldn't really work anymore, right? Because it would have been flanked or overtopped. Improved maintenance only worked to a point where it was now daily flooding. Every single high tide was going over the road. Well, that maintenance doesn't really function. And so we had all these different approaches here. And again, I'm not going to go into all the details here, but essentially this red path was the navigated pathway that was chosen, which involved kind of maintaining conditions as is, the existing usage of the beach, the dune, the road, everything as long as possible, but preparing for the fact that eventually that road maintenance was going to end and we would eventually remove that road. It would be abandoned and turned into more of a natural barrier beach system. And so this is something where we can lay out the time that it has to happen, right? Depending on what the sea level rise scenario is, you can get that information. You can track that over time, knowing when you have to make decisions moving forward. And then you can lay out these pathways of cost, target effects, side effects. And it was a really good tool for the town to utilize to basically identify how are we going to manage this area going forward. So just some examples of some flexible design and approaches that use MC-FRM data to really push projects forward. Julia, do you want to skip this exercise?
We do need to catch up a little time.
Great. I'm going to skip the flood pathway exercise and we're going to go to some of these technical data outputs. So these are the what we typically call level 3 data. And I'm going to give you some examples of what they are and how they're utilized. So Boston Water Sewer Commission used level 3 MC-FRM data, and they used time series of water surface elevations at all the outfalls from MC-FRM throughout the city of Boston. So they requested representative storms, water surface elevations, time series of those storm events that they could put at their tailwater conditions for present day going forward, say for a 1% AEP event to a 10% AEP event. And they were able to utilize with their stormwater system model to link that to identify when it rains and the tides are doing their thing in the future, or there's a storm, coastal storm coupled with rain, what happens to their system? Where does water back up? Where can it get out? Where is discharged flooding or flooding from the precipitation not being able to get into the system going to be? And so they have this whole viewer, this inundation model viewer online. I took a snapshot of it here. We worked with them to provide that data to set it up, and then they did all their work on their stormwater front to identify how the linkage between the ocean and what was happening with the precipitation for various types of storm conditions affected what they were going to do. And they were using this information to help develop things like upland storage capacity, or like how do we hold the water until we can get rid of it, as opposed to having it flood certain areas. So they're working on that, as well as adjusting systems. Where do we need to potentially fix systems in the overall stormwater network? So one example, MBTA's used it in a similar way, although not in the water. So we provided them time series information of specific AEP storm events at their tunnel egresses. So essentially, if there was an opening to their MBA tunnels, we provided what the time series of water surface elevation was overland at those locations for present day through 2070. They had a model where they looked at how the flow would go into their tunnels, what that meant for their maintenance, for their impact to their entire system, and found, that there's been a twofold increase just from 2008 to present day. And by 2030, there was 58 million in expected annualized loss. By 2100, I think that's 2070, they had 96% of MBTA's latest 5-year capital budgeted would be going into just expected annualized flood loss in their system because of coastal storm events. So an example of again, some time series information that was extracted for overland areas that they were able to utilize to do flood risk and flooding, physics-based flooding through their tunnel system. Town of Westport's doing some coastal processes modeling. This is not us doing the work, but again, we provided information in concert with some data collection at locations off of Westport. We looked at the time series of water levels, wave heights, wave periods, directions, currents. That is then plugged into a site-specific model to assess the sediment transport dynamics and patterns, right? So you can look at how the hydrodynamics in sediment transport might change over time. I showed you the Marion Wareham Bridge crossing where we did a sub-model of hydrodynamics. This is looking at hydrodynamics and sediment transport. And so you can pull individual storm events. I think we provided somewhere on the order of 20 to 30 events through the various climate scenarios over time, and provided information to at the boundaries of their models to then assess what was going on in this particular location. Langone Park is another one. It's Weston and Sampson we work with. This is a resilient waterfront park, won a lot of awards. This has actually been built. It did use level 1 and level 2 MC-FRM data throughout. But the point I'm bringing up here is we did a bunch of wave force calculations from MC-FRM into the future to help them assess that decking and the girders they were putting out in front of the park for the actual resiliency elements of the system. And so we were able to take information not only now, but into the future for various specific storm events. We have that wave information to figure out what the uplift force is on the girders, the decking was going to be, to help them figure out that design, not only for present day conditions, but also into the future. Morrissey Boulevard is a project that's happening right now, but we initially evaluated this as part of Climate Ready Dorchester, again, using MC-FRM results to inform a more site-specific model for assessing performance. And so here, for example, is one location, Morrissey Boulevard, where they were looking at living shorelines and potential nature-based solutions to look at, hey, was this something that made sense as opposed to just raising the road when we think about wave energy, erosion. And so we looked at various storm conditions and how the wave height reduction was coming into play if you did a living shoreline type element in front of the area, beach nourishment, to assess not just the structures themselves, but the actual landscape as a whole. So those are some examples of specific other data types, and there's residence times and winds that we've pulled out for certain things, future wind conditions for Logan Airport, for example, from the model that can be used for design purposes. And those are things that can be made available if needed for certain cases. I do want to go into the data viewers and data downloads, but I'm going to turn it over to Margot to just summarize that real quick again, where you can see and view and get some of these data. And then we're hoping today to leave a good chunk of time for Q&As to cover kind of the whole 3 workshop period. So Margot, do you mind running through this?
Margot, I would actually like to pause right now and take some of that Q&A time, just if anyone has any general questions about the flexible adaptation pathway discussion, because this is new content and this is most relevant to the application of the data. So does anyone have any just like conceptual questions or clarifying questions about that management approach? Feel free to unmute yourself or put a question in the chat. You will have the opportunity to review this on the recording, but it was a lot of content.
And while people are thinking a little bit about that, I will say, in the design standards tool, right, it's important to note that though flexible design and thinking about that, it does provide typically an intermediate design level from that tool that I think helps thinking through flexible, adaptable designs. Meaning, a lot of times when you're filling out that questionnaire and you get information, it's going to dump you into a 2070 level because you have a certain service life, and that's great. That's good information to know, but it does give you that intermediate level corresponding to your consequence level that you can use to help plan a flexible or adaptable approach. So it doesn't just give you one value, which I think is a really important point. So when you go through that, understand there's this intermediate target that you get for the design purposes.
Thank you. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I'm not seeing any hands. So Margot, please go ahead.
Great. Kirk, can you advance to the next slide? All right, so the purpose here is just to take a few minutes to remind you of the various interactive viewers the state has produced to provide access to the MC-FRM outputs. These are CZM's Morris data viewer, CZM's sea level rise and coastal flooding viewer, which we use in the exercise today, and the resilient MA map viewer. All three showcase level 1 MC-FRM layers. These multiple viewers were created to support different types of access needs. Next slide. We do want to remind you that MassDOT's GeoDot web portal is pointing to outdated level 1 layers, and thus we recommend going to newer data viewers and the forthcoming download page on Woods Hole Group's website to ensure you're looking at the latest version. Next slide. So the three viewers screenshots you see here were covered in training number 1. I encourage you to listen to that section of the recording if you are interested in more details. What we have here is a summary slide letting you know which pieces of level 1 MC-FRM layers are available on each viewer. While you can download the raster map image layers from Morris, and you can download a shapefile of the footprint of the 2 select annual coastal flood exceedance probabilities listed on the Resilient MA viewer. For true data download, you'll have to visit the forthcoming download page on Woods Hole Group's website that Kirk is going to touch on in a moment. All of these level 1 MC-FRM layers reflect the model version as of April 2021 and are provided for the future planning years of 2030, 2050, and 2070. Next slide. So the tool that Kirk was mentioning is the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, uses both level 1 and level 2 MC-FRM layers. I covered an overview of this tool in training number 2, and there are tool tutorials and guidance documents on the project landing page that I encourage you to review if you want more details. And I do want to remind you that the intent of this tool is to provide information at the project scale and is not intended for community or regional scale analysis. Next slide. The tool uses level 1 layers to screen whether the project site is exposed to sea level rise and storm surge. These layers include 2 annual coastal flood exceedance probabilities, the same ones that are in the Resilient MA map viewer, and a projected 2030 mean high water shoreline. The tool makes these calculations on the back end and supplements with a few user input questions on history of flooding to give a preliminary climate exposure score for this parameter for the project site. Next slide. The tool uses level 2 MC-FRM layers to provide values for the applicable coastal design criteria in the recommended design standards output, which are given for each asset. So in addition to the target and intermediate planning horizon that Kirk mentioned, for each of these applicable design criteria, there are drop-down menus for background information on what these terminology mean, dynamic tables with values derived from the MC-FRM, and guidance about how to consider this information in project planning, early design, and project evaluation. Next slide. To provide some additional context for these MC-FRM outputs, there are interactive maps of the projected water surface elevation across the site provided in the tool, and printed maps are included in the tool report. I'm going to hand it over to Kirk now to talk about the download page that is forthcoming.
Right, so we have a download page that will be released about mid-June. That's going to include all the level 1 and level 2 data layers. It will be organized by level 1 and level 2. Here's just an example of how you would go dig down into level 1 data. You would go into the specific year you'd want, and then your probability and or depth level, and then pull the specific town. Again, level 1 data is organized by town. Level 2 data, you would just download the entire coast-wide geodatabase. It will include all the regions, and then you can open that up into ArcGIS and or any GIS tool that you might use and look at and get your individual region data. We have a new website coming out, which is why I can't show you exact pictures of it, but there'll be a direct access to MC-FRM via the website, and there'll also be a direct link that will be provided. The website will include not only all the data, but README, metadata, fact sheets available that will cover a lot of the stuff we covered throughout this training series. And so you'll be able to get that information directly from there. There will be a little sign in that you have to do. Just leave your affiliation, your email address, just so we know who's downloading data, and if there's questions that we can maybe answer those questions as people go. So that again will be ready and up and functional by mid-June. Here's some of those resources and links that where you can find this. And again, we'll provide the actual direct link to the MC-FRM download page from our website as soon as that's ready to go. All the data is set up. It's all organized. It's up on the server already. It's just the front end that's getting finished so that we can be able to download that information and data. If you need data before then, you can still contact me and I will get you data to the best and as quick as my ability it will allow. So with that, we've left plenty of time for any Q&A that might be available. And if not, that's okay too. We certainly appreciate it, you guys sticking through, especially if you went through all 3 days of the workshop. Hopefully you learned something. I believe Julia has a little follow-up poll that she might want to do as well. But we have time for any questions as well.
Yes, I've launched a poll. Feel free to respond at your leisure while we take any questions. Kirk, you can see in the chat how excited Aaron is about the data download page.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I will miss your emails. Yes.
If you do have a question, please unmute yourself, put it in the chat. And as always, we will provide a PDF of the slides and a reminder of when the video is up on YouTube.
So I do see one question about revision of the data. Yes, it's very possible that level 1, level 2 data may be revised. That's part of the reason why when you download the data, we're asking you to leave your email address so that if a new release is out, we would email the entire user group to say, hey, here's what's been updated, specifically what's been updated in the model. Generally speaking, the plan is for approximately a 10-year type cycle of review of release. That's to be determined. But if there are changes and revisions, we would let that whole user group know as long as they left information on there. There has not been any changes in level 1 or level 2 data since, at least level 2 data since the release. We have not made any changes to it. So if you have level 2 data, you have the right level 2 data. That doesn't mean it can't change. And always be conscious of the limitations we covered in workshop 1 about the data. You know, one of the big things that people need to remember is, like, if some development happens somewhere in the very contemporary time frame, like last 2 years, that's not going to be in the model, right? So if people do think of questions after the fact, it's okay to touch base with myself or Julia if you do have questions. that you think of. I know that we covered it quite a bit today, so I get it. Rebecca has a question about additional calibration. That's a really good question. So we did do some additional calibration. Originally, we had released the data prior to the 2018 events, and then we went back and did some checking of that. Again, I do think that it will have to be constantly updated for that on, if sea level rise projections change, obviously landscapes change, but yeah, we get more storms, we get more storm data. Like USGS released a whole bunch of storm data that we didn't have when we originally calibrated the model. And so that, is something that we definitely should continue to think about. There's a lot of data. It's like I said, that level 2 data, there's tons of information packed in there. And it's not necessarily the simplest thing to understand, but we think that the value in it is there due to that whole ability to kind of prioritize based on the distribution. It offers a lot from that perspective. So a couple more questions. Connor's asking, and then I'll get to Aaron's. If sea level rise changes, would we simply adjust the out years to reflect this? No. So, one of the big things with a model is as you get deeper water or the sea level rise projections evolve, it's not a linear thing, right? So deeper water changes the geometry of the shoreline, for example, changes the way that waves propagate because they now have deeper water to go through and transform over. So you can't just say, oh, we have the results, let's add, another foot because sea level rise says it's another foot. It doesn't really work that way. You can do some shifting of the time scale based on, say like, 4.3 was projected to occur now, and now it's a little bit later. Yeah, some of that is allowable, but just be careful of the nonlinearities there. Aaron's asking about flood depth data for design purposes, potential misuse. We've run into a number of things. I think Julia probably has some examples as well. A misunderstanding of what the design flood elevation is a key one. Yeah, that depth versus water surface elevation is another one. Julia, you have a couple on top of your head?
The misunderstanding of the correlation between the still water elevation and FEMA's base flood elevation is the most common thing that we hear. And if people still have a question about that, review the content.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that we saw was trying to interpolate in between the levels. We had some cases where, well, we want to know what 2060 is or something, and then you would interpolate in between, and that doesn't work. Again, because that nonlinearities.
Margo, would you like to answer Simone's question?
Simone is asking if there's going to be any mandatory use requirements for grants such as MVP. I can't speak on behalf of MVP. I know there were some regional coordinators on the call earlier, but I think it's something that could be discussed. But I don't think there's any current requirements on it, at least not for this last round that went through.
I think my interpretation of that might be a little different than yours, Margot. So Simone, the MC-FRM information is an input for the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, and the MVP grant program and a few other grant programs within EEA are piloting the submission of those reports from the tool and the review of that information in the review of the applications to the grant programs. And then I'll also say from CZM's perspective and our Coastal Resilience Grant Program, we do encourage people to look at MC-FRM information and articulate how flood risk in their community and within their project area is informed by that, and describe sea level rise scenarios that you will be using for your project. Kirk, the next question is for you.
Okay. Yes, title datums, right. So a few things there, right? NOAA hasn't updated their epic for quite some time. It's a 1992 centered epic. It's off by pretty substantial amount just because of the actual sea level rise that has occurred. So when we did MC-FRM, we recalculated the mean sea level we put into the model based on the most recent epic, which turned out to be a 2008 centered epic that we utilized. That doesn't obviously capture all the sea level rise that occurred between 2008 and now. So that's one of the differences, is that there's if you're using the old mean high water of 4.54 or whatever it is in Boston, it's not even really close to that right now in the present, in the actual observed epic. And then when you go out to 2030, you have some additional rise into that. I will say, just to this group here, that the projected 2030 levels are pretty high. And so the acceleration, I'm not sure we're going to see that by 2030. It's what was decided based on the 2000 baseline. But, that's why we're providing what we're providing, to think about and adjust it. So there is a pretty significant increase in the datums because of what actually has happened, but also because of the projected sea level rise by 2030. Hopefully that answers your question. I mean, all this stuff, the uncertainties, and like everybody has like, what's the uncertainty in the model? Every time I boil this down, right? The calibration, the physics, the governing equations of flow, right? The errors associated with that are dwarfed by the projections and the uncertainty in the sea level rise, especially when you get past mid-century. So that's really the driver here. Yeah, there's the nonlinearities and the physics, and those are all important, but that sea level rise gap between the various projections is very, very large. And so it's a planning tool. It's really useful for that. And, we always say you got to keep observing what's actually happening and take that into consideration as you prioritize your projects, as you plan your projects. That shift that, Connor was mentioning is something that you can think about as you actually observe time frame. So a lot of our projects are like, where's the trigger point? Define where the trigger point is, where your comfort level goes beyond a certain amount that you need to start thinking about it. Plan for it so it doesn't catch you off guard, but understand that this is, an evolving science. Climate change projections, sea level rise, it's constantly evolving. So be prepared, but understand that if you get more time, great. That just means you get more time.
Okay, let's take one more question and then wrap up for the series. Not seeing any brave individuals wanting to have the last word. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying, Aaron, is messaging the results can be important, right? So, you know, we assign a time frame to it because when we first started this, you know, whole process, the first question we always got asked is, like, say we just said, well, it's a foot of sea level rise. The first question we always get, well, when is that going to occur, right? However, I think it is very, very important that you put in context that, hey, this is 1 foot of sea level rise and it might occur between X and Y, right? And so that messaging is a good thing to think about when you're thinking about planning horizons. I know we tied a specific time frame to it, but really you need to talk about both when you're going forward with that value. It's certainly important. And I'm sure these things will constantly evolve, right? Like it's going to update. And remember, one of the key things that I think the state really decided on is like, we want to make sure we're not in a coin flip situation, right? In these monthly projections or observations of sea level, they're pretty variable. And so there was one point in time where there were 2 peaks where the high projection was way behind what was actually occurring. And then later on it flattened out. Now it's a little bit, you know, too much, right? So it's certainly variable. And again, that's where that planning, the uncertainty, where you got to keep your eye on things, has to make sense.
I just put the link to the MC-FRM FAQ document in the chat if you do need to refresh your memory on the sea level rise projections that were modeled for the different scenarios. All right, we are going to call it a wrap. And thank you all for investing so much time into learning more about the model, all of the products that are available to the public and will soon be available for download and use. We at CZM and EEA also want to thank Woods Hole Group for working with us on this training. We know that people have been asking for more information since the products have rolled out through various projects, and we're happy that we now have the videos online, and we will be releasing a fact sheet that will capture some of the high level information that you need.
And I just want to thank everybody for being here, listening. You know, hopefully this will make the number of questions less, but you know, the data understanding more, right? And so really happy to talk to everybody, record these and make the data available for everybody to utilize. So